My name is Dr. Holly Lisenby. I'm from the National Institute of Mental Health, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this special session on brain behavior quantification and synchronization, or BBQS, laying the foundation for a new data and knowledge ecosystem. And I want to emphasize the word ecosystem. We really want this to be participatory, and we've saved time at the end for 1 or 2 questions after each speaker, and then a discussion at the end. And we really are excited to engage you in the discussion. And so I'm going to just start by introducing our fantastic speakers. First, we'll hear from Dr. Marianne Schneschi, who will be talking about the types of data that can be collected and systems engineering's approaches to understand neural systems that give rise to complex behaviors. Then we'll be hearing from Dr. Ashley Feinsinger, who is an expert in ethics and philosophy, who will be talking about some of the ethical issues and opportunities that collecting these sorts of neural and behavioral data from human samples raise. And they'll be hearing from Dr. Satra Ghosh, who is an expert in terms of data science and AI, and we'll be talking about approaches to be able to make these data available and to use them to advance our understanding of the brain. And I want to mention some about our title, why we've titled this Brain Behavior Quantification Synchronization. This workshop is really inspired by an NIH Brain Initiative program called BBQS, and I'd like to thank and recognize the many members of the BBQS team that are shown here. Many of you are in the audience and attending this meeting. First of all, a huge shout out to Dr. Dana Schlosser, who is my co-lead on the BBQS team. You can see that this team is quite interdisciplinary and Trans Institute. And so we're really excited about the program. And to learn more, you see a QR code there that will take you to some of our active funding opportunities. So briefly, what is BBQS? This is a program whose goal is to develop tools, platforms, and theories that will enable us to quantify precisely behaviors as a multidimensional response to the environment, and to do this at high resolution and in a way that we can synchronize this behavioral data with simultaneously recorded neural data. We're also seeking to build a consortium, and today is the kickoff of that consortium, of investigators that represent the disciplines that are engaged in this type of pursuit to help us develop and disseminate not only the hardware and software tools, but also ontologies to be able to characterize and understand complex behaviors, and ethical frameworks so that we can be sure that we are addressing the ethical issues, particularly with respect to human research, from the very beginning. And that's really baked into the entire program. The impact that we seek to have with the BBQS program is to disseminate these tools, to develop novel paradigms, and ultimately to inform novel therapeutic interventions, which may implement closed-loop systems or other types of circuit-based therapies to improve outcomes for people living with brain-based disorders. And importantly, a robust ethical framework that will enable this to be accomplished. BBQS, the idea is to develop these high-resolution tools to study how brain gives rise to behavior as a multidimensional response. This diagram illustrates that some of the data categories that we can measure from the brain and from the body that reflect changes in internal states, and these can be quantified. And we seek to do this in a dynamically changing environment to be able to capture not just what's going on with the individual, but also what's going on in the environment that is related to these changes in internal states or behavioral states. I mentioned that we have 4 areas of focus within BBQS. The first is called organismal behavior, and this is an effort led by Dr. Holly Moore, which does do trans-species studies to be able to do transformative and integrative models of behavior at the organismal level. The second program is the Human Neuroscience Program, which is led by Dr. Lizzie Ankodovich, who's also here. This supports studies in human and clinical populations to simultaneously record brain and behavior. We're developing another area of emphasis in the area of sensor technology. This effort is led by Dr. Yvonne Bennett to support next generation sensor technologies for the development and capture of the complexity of behavior. And of course, the overarching aspect of this is where did the data go and how do we make them usable? And that's the Data Archive, Coordination, and Artificial Intelligence Centers. And the lead on this is Dr. Ming Zhang, who's also here today. And I do encourage all of our BBQS team members to participate during the Q&A as well. So I mentioned that today is the kickoff of our consortium. So what do we mean by a consortium? This will ultimately be coordinated through the BBQS Data Coordination and Artificial Intelligence Center. It will be comprised of not only BBQS-funded investigators, but also open to other investigators who are generating these types of data. It's meant to support technology, platforms, and software sharing, data standards, tool dissemination, and outreach. And also part of the consortium will be addressing the neuroethics in consultation with the ethicists that are embedded within the BBQS projects, as well as Team N within the NIH Brain Initiative and the Neuroethics Working Group, or the NUG, part of Brain. And so we're officially kicked off. So welcome, all of you. You're all invited to be part of this consortium, and the fact that you chose to attend today suggests to me that you are here for that purpose. So now I'd like to ask our AV support to switch us to the next presentation, and now I'd like to invite Dr. Miriam Shineshi to the podium.
So thank you, everyone. Holly, this is a great program. And what I'm going to talk about, which relates to BBQS, is our efforts to develop brain behavior AI algorithms as well as neurotechnologies. So as we all know, brain disorders are a leading cause of disability worldwide and affect tens of millions of patients. And unfortunately, a large proportion of patients are actually resistant to our current treatments. For example, in the case of major depression, 20 to 30% of patients are resistant to drugs or psychotherapy. So the question becomes, what do we do for these patients? Now, based on the evidence that these disorders are signs of abnormal activity across large-scale brain networks, one idea could be to try to decode and directly regulate these abnormal activity patterns. So what do these activity patterns that I'm talking about look like? I'm showing you intracranial electrodes that we implant in the human brain. And these are the types of signals that we record from them. So you can see that these signals are complex, they're noisy. There's no clear patterns in these signals that would, for example, tell me what somebody's mood is in depression. So in order to regulate these signals, we envision building a closed loop engineered system that would model them and then decode from them an underlying brain state, let's say mood in depression, and use that as feedback within a controller that would then adjust the therapy parameters, for example, deep brain stimulation, frequency, and amplitude, in order to take symptom state towards a target healthy state. Now, this is an example of a closed-loop control system, and as engineers, we are actually very good at building these systems. For example, think about autopilots. So you may ask me, why is it then that we still cannot do this for the brain? Now, of course, unlike an engineered system, we did not design the brain. It's an immensely complex system of over 80 billion neurons and with unknown dynamics, and that introduces a huge AI challenge to build data-driven models of this complex system and to come up with data collection frameworks, including neural behavioral data collection frameworks that can enable this modeling. And that is what my lab focuses on. So we work at the interface of AI, control theory, and neuroscience to build AI-based closed-loop decoding and regulation systems for the brain and enable a new generation of neurotechnologies and brain-computer interfaces, both for movement disorders, but also beyond, for mental health conditions. So what are the challenges involved in building this closed-loop system? Of course, the first challenge is to build this decoder. that would take these high-dimensional signals and decode a mental state. And to do this, as I showed you, we record intracranial brain activity across a network of brain regions. And simultaneous with that, we need to collect some behavioral measures of mental state. Now, the measures so far have been in the form of self-reports. So for example, you give a mood self-report to patients a couple times a day to behaviorally assess their mental state over time. So this is the data set we have to use to build out decoders. Now, this is a difficult machine learning challenge because we have to model these high-dimensional complex neural activity patterns using very sparse behavioral labels. So back in 2018, we developed a new dimensionality reduction method for brain data, and we showed that indeed we could decode mood variations related to depression and anxiety in individual patients. This was very exciting because it wasn't possible before and opened the door to objective tracking of these states. But back then, we had to rely on decoding from just a couple of brain regions. And there are two reasons for that. One was the sparsity and noisiness of our behavioral measures, which are the self-reports. The other was that back then we had to rely on a linear dynamical system backbone. So what does it take for us to go towards decoding from brain networks? There are two directions we can think about. One is to get richer behavioral measures, go beyond our self-reports, develop new techniques for richer behavioral monitoring. And that's one hallmark of BBQS. The other is to develop novel AI and computational methods that can address the complexity of brain networks. That's another hallmark within the BBQS. All right, so let's say we solve this challenge, build our decoder, find a biomarker. Unfortunately, that's not enough. Because even if I can perfectly decode somebody's mood, I still don't know how to simulate, to regulate, or change it. So what we need to do next is to build this feedback controller. Now, towards that goal, we've been developing models that describe the effect of stimulation on brain activity by pairing together novel stochastic brain stimulation patterns with linear dynamical system models. And we've shown that this can predict how neural activity changes in response to a time-varying stimulation. So this is great, this is promising, but again, this relies on a linear dynamical system backbone. And there's a good reason for that, because these linear models allow us to build a real-time decoding system. But of course, there's nonlinearity in neural representation. So can we develop AI architectures that capture nonlinearity yet at the same time are amenable to real-time implementation and decoding? And that's a topic we've been working on very recently. For example, in a recent paper, we showed that we can develop an architecture we call Define that jointly learns a nonlinear manifold embedding and linear dynamical systems on top of that. And by doing so, we get the best of both worlds. We capture nonlinearity to improve decoding, yet we can run it in real time. Finally, a major challenge in building the system is the fact that these neural recordings that we obtain do not just relate to the behavioral state that we are interested in decoding or regulating, but rather to a mixture of them. For example, right now I'm talking, I'm moving my arm, maybe I'm thirsty, maybe I'm nervous. All of those states are simultaneously represented in my brain. So for example, if you think about these brain states that give rise to your neural recordings, it could be that only a minority of them are shared with the behavior of interest, whether it's mood surveys or arm movements. So can we disentangle only those green behaviorally relevant states? If we use unsupervised models that I've shown you so far, we may actually miss these shared states. So with that motivation in the past few years, we've been developing machine learning algorithms for joint neural and behavioral modeling that achieve this disentanglement. We've incorporated the effect of inputs within these models. And very recently, in a paper that's upcoming, we've developed an AI architecture that not only achieves this disentanglement, but can also capture nonlinearity. Now, we've tested this for decoding of movements across multiple non-human primate data sets, and we've showed that this architecture actually improves the decoding of movements as well as the prediction of neural data. But this is for movements. What about more complex behaviors, including those related to mental states, which could be intermittently observed, which could be categorical and much more noisy? So that's one direction that we have to address for building this closed loop system. The other question is, can we go beyond one modality of neural data to incorporate both multiple neural modalities as well as physiological data? Again, all of these are directions of interest within the BBQS portfolio. All right, so our vision at the end of the day is a closed loop system that takes in multimodal neural, behavioral, and physiological wearable data, fuses information across them to get the most accurate readout of mental state, and then uses those to personalize and precisely tailor various types of therapy. This could be neurostimulation, it could be pharmacological intervention, or even psychotherapy. And this vision, of course, involves many, many challenges, some of which we will be working on as part of an R61 program within the BBQS program that we're very grateful to have received. So in this program, the challenges that we're going to look at is first obtaining richer behavioral modalities beyond self-reports, including audio-visual modalities, as well as combining our neural activity patterns with physiological data to get more accurate decoding of behavior. And this, of course, is a very multidisciplinary effort across the School of Medicine and the School of Engineering, Electrical Engineering, Computer Science, Neurosurgery, Psychiatry, as well as, of course, raising a lot of ethical questions that we are working with the Department of Philosophy at University of Washington to address. So the final vision will be to develop sensing and AI technologies that can extract mental state from neurophysiological data for objective symptom monitoring. So with that, I would like to thank my lab, thank BBQS for their grateful support, and I'm very grateful for their support, and I'll take a few quick questions before I hand over.
So for questions, we have a mic in the center of the aisle.
Thank you. Is it on? Okay. Miriam, thank you for your talk. Perspective, which is the next phase of this program. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you may have encountered or you may in future may encounter integrating sensor data with the brain recordings?
Yeah, so there are multiple challenges. One is to develop sensors that are easy for real-time and everyday monitoring, right? So wearable sensors that can measure multimodal data beyond, say, the heart rate or skin conductance, going through also biochemical sensing. The other is to synchronize those with all of these complex neural and behavioral data. So I think there's a lot of challenges when we think about innovating on the sensor front and how that would integrate with our current technologies. Yes.
Thank you for an interesting talk. You used depression kind of as your example, and it occurs to me that depression might not be best represented in, say, a binary variable that you can decode. Like, it's possible that you can sort of see graded effects.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, how that influences the goal here of trying to like separate the brain into punctate states when that might not actually be the best representation.
Mm-hmm.
And then how that evolves on the therapeutic end.
Yeah.
And at the same point, when you're trying to potentially change someone's mood, it seems like an error would be like quite concerning. So how do we balance the need for simple representation so we can make a change versus the possibility of false decoding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, we are not measuring it as a binary variable. We actually have these self-reports that have actually a continuous scale. And in our decoding, we actually measure and decode a continuum of mood scales related to depression and anxiety symptoms. So we do have that gradation. In terms of regulating these mood states, I mean, some of even the open loop deep brain stimulation studies have shown that you can actually alleviate depression symptoms. So if we can get this biomarker and feedback, we are hoping that we can actually make those more effective and personalize them for even better results.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could address. I wonder if you could address variability in the signals between individuals. Obviously, individuals will be different, but even, and I think this is related to the prior question, even within an individual, the decoder might work differently from one day to the next. That poses a lot of issues in terms of that dream of some feedback resolution, which is so complicated, it's hard to even wrap my head around it. But what do you do about the variability? Because I imagine that those signatures are so heterogeneous, it's hard to make inferences about the general, brain areas that you'd like to then address.
Fantastic question. So we not only have inter-individual, but intra-individual variability we have to address. So the inter-individual variability, we do it by personalizing the training of these models. Even if we pull data across individuals to have more data for one unified model, we can do fine-tuning downstream to personalize it to an individual. Within individual, we develop recalibration and adaptive tracking techniques. So these are techniques that, for example, update the biomarker model parameters over time based on the error signal. For example, in decoding of, say, the state. So if you see, my decoding is really bad, something is off with my model, then you can actually recalibrate that based on the error signal. Yeah. So we do have.
And what's the ground truth for that? The person's report?
The two ground truths you can think about. One is the neural prediction itself, which is unsupervised with respect to the report. That gets you a long way. But at the end, even if that doesn't work, then you can have like a recalibration session to obtain a few reports, behavioral measures, and then further recalibrate. So there are multiple ways to go around that.
Great. Thank you. This is fantastic Q&A, and we will have more time for Q&A at the end. And now that we've heard about the types of data that we'd like to collect and how we'd like to use them, let's now hear about the ethical implications from Dr. Ashley Feinsinger.
I'm markedly shorter. Okay, there we go. So first, I just want to say thank you to Brain and for this program. As you heard before, ethics is really being integrated in a meaningful way into both kind of the requirements for these grants, but also the goals of what we are trying to achieve with these grants. And I think, we heard last night from the Brain director and from those who are on the stage, this is, new to really integrate ethics from day one. And so I just want to express gratitude for that. That also comes with challenges. And so you may have also heard last night, Dr. Eddie Chang talking about, when you are sitting at the forefront, kind of before a new type of research and new types of studies are being done, it can be very difficult to articulate or have the interpretive resources to communicate what those ethical challenges might be. So I'm going to try to attempt to do that today, but hopefully we'll have a nice discussion and brainstorm together about how that might go. So my name is Ashley Feinsinger. I am a neuroethicist at UCLA. I am also the co-director of the UCLA CDU Center for Neuroscience and Society. And so asking these questions is very timely. There are a lot of efforts and initiatives underway to really connect neuroscience with larger social environmental variables. And I think this funding opportunity is well poised to contribute to that. I'd like to, so I guess, my talk is going to be a really bird's eye view of what some of the emerging ethical issues in this research might be, with a focus on technology development and human research. That's where my training is. And hopefully, again, with the goal of building excitement and inviting you all to kind of partner with ethicists in building these frameworks. I think it's great to require ethicists to be on grants, but that is not enough to actually build a framework that is relevant to researchers, usable, and comprehensive. I am going to start by just a brief introduction to some of the research that I'm involved in and a BBQS project that I am doing. I am not the scientist on this grant, so I'm going to have to read it, and hopefully I'll do a good job. So let's start. So this is work, by the way, that is led by Dr. Nanthia Suthana. So a decade ago, significant breakthrough occurred when the FDA granted approval for the first implanted neuromodulation devices capable of recording intracranial EEG activity. These devices have since been implanted in several thousands of individuals to address a spectrum of neurological and psychiatric conditions, including epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, and to a lesser extent, disorders like PTSD, OCD, loss of control, and obesity. And this is just a really brief video I'll show you of a patient who, having received bilateral hippocampal electrodes for the treatment of epilepsy, volunteered to visit the Suthana laboratory at UCLA and engage in memory studies under a more mobile and real world conditions. It's just, there's no sound, but you can just see a little bit of what that looks like for someone who has an implanted device to also be kind of integrated with a lot of other modalities of recording to do some basic human science research. So because this device is fully shielded from external noise, participants have the freedom to move around without constraint. And in these studies, researchers provide them with a suite of on-body wearable sensors. This is just a few of them here, including motion caption sensors, biometric sensors, enabling researchers to monitor vital indications like skin conductance, heart rate, among others. There's also eye tracking technology, which enhances researchers' understanding of their visual focus and engagement. And also participants are able to wear a VR and AR headset, which allows researchers to precisely manage the timing and nature of the stimuli they encounter. So as many of you will know, mobile eye EEG recording and stimulation has been able to contribute to understanding a wide range of phenomena, including things relevant to social interaction, observational learning, understanding movement, sleep, fear detection and treatment, eating, involving a multitude of patient types. So patients with OCD, depression, as we just heard about, epilepsy, and PTSD. So as part of the BBQS project, I think this technology is being innovated on in two ways, at least, to kind of update some of the wearable sensors. So I think, again, don't really know what this slide is, but I think it's about, updating the sensors to be able to better capture cortisol and norepinephrine, and then also innovations to the wearable parts that interact with the implanted device. So moving from a more kind of cumbersome headset to something like a really sleek head cap, which also enables new types of studies to be done, enables participants to go out into the real world. That video was just in a lab setting, but this enables participants to be like walking around outside, which raises a host of ethical issues, allows new research to be done. I think in our case will be in the EMU setting. So that means all participants will be epilepsy patients who are in the EMU with implanted devices, waiting to have a seizure. And that is a very complex research context. And so understanding what some of the ethical issues are of conducting this research in that patient population is something we are very concerned with. I won't go through these, but these are just some of the main goals of the project. Something that's of most interest to the ethics and the team of us that are working on this is this last one. Really kind of innovating on these technologies provides opportunities to determine neural mechanisms of naturalistic human behaviors and to test closed loop stimulation therapies. Okay, so I think what I can offer in terms of an ethical conversation, I want to offer kind of two lenses that we've been thinking about in our work for trying to anticipate the kind of new dimensions of traditional ethical concerns, but also how to anticipate some emerging novel ethical challenges that we may not have in studies where we are just using one of these modalities. So the first is to consider the ways in which combining multiple types of data and technology might give rise to special ethical issues kind of within a single study. There are at least three ways to think about this. So these projects inherit all of the ethical issues of each modality in a kind of cumulative sense. So we have ethical concerns with doing single neuron recordings with participants who are in the EMU, for example, but then also combined with all of the ethical issues we might face when we are doing video recording. So what types of data is that capturing for people? How do we de-identify those? So it's kind of a cumulative sense. We might also think about those ethical issues taking on new dimensions when they are combined. So there may be certain aspects of consent, for example, that may get amplified or carry more weight when we are combining different modalities of sensing and stimulation. And the third is that those combinations may raise new ethical issues altogether that we often don't anticipate when we are just thinking about one modality of stimulation and recording. So I guess, we can go through these in detail in a second, but you can imagine with the study that I just shared with you, if we're thinking about single unit recording, some of the things we think about ethically are the surgical risks, because that is an invasive modality of implantable devices, the kind of overlap of research in care, often that is occurring when we are gathering that information, whether participant populations might already have electrodes in their heads, something we were talking about earlier today, whether they are enrolled in other studies at the same time. How do we need to talk about this study in conjunction with some of those other studies? And also just kind of a broad question about when is it appropriate to take advantage of those clinical opportunities for research like this. And then combining that with other modalities you can imagine. So video recordings raise a separate set of privacy issues, different from those of invasive recordings. There's really interesting research emerging from another ethics group about how participants think about the concept of invasiveness. So we have a view about that in medicine that has to do with how far it kind of penetrates into the skin. But in many ways, participants may feel that a video recording of them as they are experiencing a PTSD episode or as they are having compulsive thoughts. Yeah, that went real fast. Okay. Might be way more invasive and require different levels of de-identification and also different ways of sharing that information back with them. So I'm going to go really fast now. I just want to share, and we have plenty of time for discussion after. The other way that we try to anticipate and mitigate some of these concerns is not just by thinking about the overlapping of modalities, but also thinking about kind of the dimensions of impact. I think maybe what we might be tempted to kind of focus on at the beginning of some of these studies are issues around data, ethical issues around data, and that makes sense when we're at the data collecting phase, but finding ways to kind of hold all of these other considerations as part of the conversation, even when you're on the data side. So I have like 1 minute. So in order to, I will just go very quickly through a rough brainstorming that my team and having conversations with BBQ researchers, a kind of combination, or I don't know, amuse-bouche is the appetizer of things you might think about as you're going forward. And hopefully you can have access to these slides to look at later. So data turns out to be like a really complicated thing. Thinking about, I won't mention all of these, but I want to mention AI and the role of AI in making predictions about when somebody might be about to go into a depressive episode, and how do we share that information with them in ways that kind of do not disrupt their self-narrative and their identity. And I know there's really interesting ethical work being done on how do we fit together self-report and intracranial recordings when they may not make they may not be synchronized in that way. Data ownership and sovereignty is something that I just want to mention. I think we have learned a lot from the Human Genome Project and ways in which, as we gather more and more personalized information about someone, there are deep questions about who owns that data. And we might look to work that researchers have done with indigenous populations to kind of renegotiate how we can share ownership of that data. We can talk about the rest of these categories in the discussion. Lots of concerns about stigma, I think, for some of these studies, for some of these patients who may not feel super great about some of these episodes, some of their thoughts being recorded, video recorded, and then shared. We need to talk about that. I think going all the way up the scale is worth it. So I'll take like 30 seconds to just make a plug for thinking about the downstream clinical impacts of some of the data and the resulting technologies that we might get out of these projects. I'm thinking about, I think all of these things on your left kind of go together, but asking questions about the more we learn about the brain as a complex organism that is adapting to the social environment, the more there is probably a bit of a worry that we might be tempted to then kind of reduce those things like depression, like OCD, like chronic pain, to kind of purely biological or brain phenomena. And we know from other fields of study that these things are really complex biopsychosocial phenomena. So how will the resulting technologies be responsibly integrated with other types of interventions? I want to plug for that. And then lastly, really thinking about equity, access, and disparities, even as we're capturing, typing, and sharing data. Probably the one, if I had to pick one, this is so stressful. I don't know what I would pick. I would pick something like, maybe, are we missing cultural and structural factors that also contribute to our understanding of things like depression, OCD, and PTSD? So we might get really good at capturing some aspects of the social environment, but how do we then kind of bring in some of those other things that may not be as measurable, you can't measure with a sensor and stuff like that. So that's where I'll stop, and I want to just say thank you for giving me that time. Great.
I think we have time for one question. If there are any questions.
Yeah.
One thing you didn't bring up here, because these are your studies, I know, are mostly on individuals, but
Yeah.
as you release people into the wild, they will interact with other people.
Yeah.
This is also an ethical issue that came up, obviously, in genetic studies, that there are other people, family, friends, whatever, who are not consenting, but are become part of the data. And is that something you're thinking
Oh yeah,
about?
that's huge. Yeah, I think that's right. And so there are even studies that are being worked out where we might be video recording in combination with EEGs of children in a school setting, right, to try to understand ADHD and how we can better treat them. And so there are also situations in where there are other children that are being captured. I think that is a huge issue and something that might be markedly different about this type of research. I don't know how to address that, but I think that should be at the forefront of what we think about. Yeah.
Wonderful. So now that we've heard about the types of data we'd like to collect, how we're going to use them, and some of the ethical concerns raised, now I'd like to talk about where we're going to put the data, how we're going to understand them, and how we're going to use AI. Thank you, Dr. Satra Ghosh.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you to the BBQS team and the program for inviting me to this. Now that we've heard from Mariam and Ashley around some of the complications on the engineering and the ethical side, we need to put all of these things together and put all things not just in the digital landscape of data and AI and technology, but also in the people landscape of teams coming together to solve these things. So I'm going to start where my neuroscience kind of started. Let's hope that this comes through. I study human spoken communication from the research side, and it starts early, as you can see. Not that we can understand what they're communicating, but there is an intent and a nature to communicate. And it involves speech, it involves arm movements, it involves gestures to communicate. And about 64 years back, we got a glimpse into what the motor control of human communication looks like.
Why did Ken set the soggy net on top of his deck? I have put blood on her 2 clean yellow shoes. Stop.
It was one of the first sets of sensors that gave us an exquisite look into the fine motor control we have. And finally,
I can't. Try.
the sound disappeared. I'll play the next one.
Hello, I'm Sarah Scott. It was my stroke anniversary last weekend. I had my stroke 8 years.
So communication breaks down, and there's something about the brain, some resilience part of it that brings some of it back. And that's what this program is partly about. We want to understand this link between brain and behavior that comes together to tell us something about that link, not just in the context of speech, spoken communication. But I like spoken communication because it forms this closed loop system in the brain itself. that Miriam was talking about. It also has this open loop system of communicating with others, a listener, an interaction component to this. And it covers a fair bit of real estate. Now, this is through fMRI. It's not the precision that we are hoping in the BBQS program, but it tells us how much our sensors might need to monitor to give us an insight into a complex behavior as human communication. This is where the scale of the brain kind of comes in. When I started studying this, I wanted to understand it through the lens from subcellular all the way to whole brain scale. Much easier said than done. We don't have information, and despite all the efforts in data sharing, which spans continents and much of the support from the BRAIN Initiative to create data repositories, studying this process is still hard. We don't have enough connected data and information to be able to do so. So in BBQS, I'm hoping that an ecosystem develops which puts together infrastructure, data standards, ML/AI and compute things, ethics and training together. And we have to look at it through the lens of 3 different dimensions. Availability. Not much of our data is currently available. We need to increase this. And this is different from accessibility, right? Data can be restricted to protect privacy. Availability and accessibility are 2 different dimensions. Discoverability. Yeah, we might tear our hair to get at data today. But we need a system that allows us to search efficiently. We are in the 21st century. If GPTs and LLMs are around us, we need to make this much, much easier to get to. Finally, usability. Thanks to the BRAIN Initiative program, a lot of data are being put out there. But is it all usable? We need to understand how usable data is through these lenses. So I'm going to take these 5 areas and quickly go over some of the things we have been doing to kind of talk about how this ecosystem could be built around the BBQS program. So one of the data archives that we have been fortunate enough to be funded by the BRAIN Initiative and been building is DANDY. It stores neurophysiology data right now up to, I think, across 15 species, including humans to a certain extent. And it's being used in 2 other BRAIN Initiative projects, the BICAN program, the CONNEX program. And what it has told us is today, nobody should think about we cannot share data. We have the technological capabilities to do so. Size is not a problem. And if you have a problem, come talk to me. The willingness and intent to share the data is a very different set of this scale, but sharing data in a collaborative space. And in fact, we call this a collaborative ecosystem for neurophysiology projects because it is almost like Google Drive for you as scientists. You can share data with each other. You can download data. You can collaborate in teams. You can compute right next to data, which is what we will need in this particular ecosystem. And as an offshoot of some of this infrastructure work, we've been doing work with the Allen Institute for Brain Science to bring about a knowledge graph or a knowledge base on top of this kind of system. Neuroscience is not isolated. We're talking about this thing between our ears, right? It doesn't matter whether we're studying it at the molecular level, at the circuit level, at the behavioral level. We need to be able to bring that knowledge together. To represent this information, we've been using standards. Neurodata Without Borders, OMEs-R for microscopy, and bring the content together. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I'll bring up another standard that has influenced a lot of what we do, the BID standard. It was really about an organizational principle, but the reason I want to show this is not about what BIDS is the timeline. Standards are like languages. They evolve over time because our sensors are changing, our data are changing, our experiments are changing. And we have to think about this not as a static state, but something that we can continue to evolve as a community and improve it as the needs arise. It's not set in stone. They help us, but it should continue to evolve. Moving on from standards, I want to highlight AI and ML through the lens of this platform called BrainScore, which is being developed at MIT. It is about connecting the dots between brain activity and neural models that support or reflect human behavior. I'll take one example where there's neurophysiological recording coming from an animal looking at an image and a corresponding brain map model that mimics that behavior. And this is just an example of a model comes in. Now I'm going to emphasize 4 components of this system that I think are relevant to BBQS. Data, it needs to exist. You can't build a model without data. 2, models need to exist. We need a place to bring models together that can be evaluated against the data. 3, benchmarks. How do we evaluate models? How do we compare models together? 4, metrics. Once we have benchmarks, can we look at various ways in which we can put those models together? And that's what I like about the system. It brings these 4 elements together. This doesn't mean that you can't have AI tools that help you with different kinds of processing, different kinds of analysis. This is really about evaluating models. And when we have tools, even as tools, we need to understand how well does it work? And we need a system to be able to give us that. You heard a fair bit about this from Ashley, so I'm not going to go into details over here, but maybe I can point to a couple of things. When I use the word open, I really mean equitable access. Open doesn't mean it cannot be restricted for privacy. It's about getting access to data that these participants are participating in our studies to provide for the benefit of other people who might be in their conditions. So we need a way to amplify their contributions through the lens of ethics. And we have to have these conversations at the very earliest stage of a consortium such as this. We also have to balance benefits with risks. When we think about human data, we often go quite a bit on the fear-mongering and privacy protection side. We have to balance that in the consideration of benefits that that kind of data sharing might provide people. The final thing that I'm going to talk about is training. Maybe for those of you who are software engineers or infrastructure developers, you hear the word a full stack developer. It seems like today we need full stack scientists. Scientists who need to understand what multi-scale, multi-species neuroscience means, what sensors are there at different scales of behavior and different scales of biology. The ethical considerations around neurotech, AI, legal considerations, and data science, bringing in AI and ML, bias and fairness into consideration altogether. This is a tall order for any individual, and that's why we need team science. There are many, many people here who are experts in many different domains of this. As a consortium, it needs to bring together these people to be efficient about solving some of these issues. I'll also bring in something that we started about 12 or 13 years back at this point in time, a hackathon. This has been highly successful in the brain imaging community as a training vehicle that brings in people across different career stages. It brings in people who are designing things around problems, who are bringing hacking. Now, from the institution that I am, the word hack kind of originated there. Not as a software. It's not breaking software. It's really about solving challenging problems in clever ways. And that could be designing. You don't have to write a line of code to hack. So I'm going to end with this slide again. This is the scale of the brain, and we're trying to understand and acquire data representing this scale. But we're doing this in the context of behavior, where we want to measure, predict, and adjust behavior to affect the clinical space. And this behavior comes from observing things across a variety of different sensors, across human subjective information, across interventions that are taking place, stitched through a closed loop system of coming through maybe an AI assistant, maybe a set of AI technologies, but bringing in participants, caregivers, clinicians into the picture. All of this has to exist in an ecosystem for BBQS. With that, I thank you for your attention and can take any questions.
So we have time for a couple of questions for Dr. Ghosh, then we'll open it up to the rest of the panel. And there is a microphone in the center aisle.
It seems to me that preserving the usability of data goes beyond just like the ability to share it, but also the ability to tie all that data into the often extensive metadata that explains how it was collected, the designs of studies, and things like that. And those can be quite difficult to make uniform across a lot of different groups with different methodologies and different technological assets. So what do you propose as a way to try to resolve this big gap?
It's definitely a challenge, bringing data and metadata together. And the way I think about it is provenance. When you look at a downstream use of data, what you're really interested in sometimes is understanding where that data came from, how it was acquired, all the details of it. And depending on the kinds of experiments being done, as you said, there's a lot of diversity. And this is where a language like NWB kind of comes in. It may not be perfect, but it's a language that helps harmonize that space. But this is where also AI and other tools and technologies come in to get that information structured in a way that's easier to comprehend by both humans and machines downstream. And I think that's going to be critical for us to keep in mind, is that we want information to be consumable by both humans and machines. And that requires structuring. Now, there are various programs that the BRAIN Initiative has supported to help with tools to get your data into a standard. And we hope that in this ecosystem, again, that there are people who will come together to build tools to make each data collection effort easier. I'm not going to say we can, flick a wand and it'll happen. I wish that would be easy. So it'll require work. But that early standardization is one piece. The second piece is computing on it. So maybe there are some leveraging points that one could use to say, hey, if you get your data into the standard, all of this analysis becomes easier. You get access to these kinds of compute. And maybe that's a little bit of a carrot to get some of these things together in one standard. But capturing that data is non-trivial. I don't want to trivialize it. And it will require a lot of work across every single project to come together to do that.
Thank you.
We have time for discussion. I'd like to thank all three of our excellent speakers and ask you all to approach the mic in the center aisle and also invite the speakers to ask each other questions as well.
Probably more on the ethics concern. So you've raised our, agitation a little bit with all those facets, right? We need to think about, and many researchers maybe then will kind of better not to take on collecting those complicated data sets. How much of handbook do we have already ready for researchers to kind of go through these ethical concerns and check mark, okay, I've done this, I've got this consent form, I've deposited data to this data archive, to prepare for them so they are not maybe that afraid of collecting such ethically loaded data sets?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is this on? No, it wasn't. That's a great question. It's probably a question for all of us, actually, which I really like to have questions that they're ethical in nature, but they do have a technical component to them. I think education is not the right word, because I don't think that ethicists are necessarily have a monopoly on how to educate other people in ethics. But if there were some, I think the consortium is probably well positioned to do some of that. Certainly check marks and things on your list that you can make sure you've gone through at least the minimum things that we care most about. And I think that's something that we don't even have proposed yet. What are those must-have things that we need to make into necessary checklists is one way to do it. I think that leaves open a wide range of other things that researchers might be nervous about. I do think the only way to make progress on that is to have conversation about it and to try to build together what are the real ethical concerns with collecting this data, what is a little bit kind of anticipatory or fear mongering, or we're worried about mind reading, those types of things, and what are the real things that are happening now, and to do that with researchers so that it feels like a collective responsibility. And I think barriers to kind of being comfortable collecting that data will go down. I don't know, do you have any other thoughts about how to
I like the term communication and conversation. And I think I'll use the term, since we've been talking about loops, shortening those loops. Getting people together to talk about this as early on in the process, I think is going to change how we think about the evolution of some of these considerations. If it was black and white, we would have had it. It's not.
Just one comment. I love talking about it, but what I would like to arrive is to have people not to talk at all, right? So there is a checklist and I just follow it and it's automated and I'm safe and I know my data collected. So I think talking is important, but achieving automation, closed loop experimentation, that's what kind of gets you there.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. I mean, I do think having conversation at the early stage to figure out and negotiate what those checklist things should be is very important. I also think being able to have conversations within your team. So maybe you don't need to have conversations with IRBs or with us all the time, but being able to feel kind of confident enough in those competencies to say like, hey, I've done all those checklisty things, but I'm still able to recognize in my study that there are other things that are not captured, and how will I negotiate that? Yeah, good question.
Great. Dana, I'd like to recognize Dr. Dana Schlosser, who I have the honor of co-leading this program with. Please go ahead, Dana.
Thank you. I'm going to keep this brief because I see there's several people behind me. But one of the visions of BBQS is also this bringing together different model species, including human as another model organism. How do you see that challenge of really crosswalking or, looking at those data or leveraging those data across species? Is that something that you have thought more about?
I'll take that example, and I mentioned earlier that we're building this knowledge graph infrastructure together with the Allen Institute. I think that's an ideal place for doing that crosswalk. What kind of data exists? Where does that data come from? What kind of behavioral experiments have been run in those? Again, we live in the world of LLMs and GPTs. We want that kind of information to be available at our fingertips, and it's not right now. So I think that's what needs to happen to make that be accessible again to the entire scientific community. The pieces are there. We have to put it together.
And it's not a trivial task.
Please.
First of all, I want to congratulate you for a wonderfully balanced and thought-inspiring session. And I actually want to contribute a comment because I think this may be the place out of the conference to make that. I was, for the last few days, as a neuroscientist, super, super excited about all the technology and all the incredible advancements I've seen. And then here in this session, some really disturbing thought came to me, and that is mental health conditions are environmentally induced to a very large degree. And there's a point where, as a scientific community, we are trying to engineer ourselves out of what might, at the essence, be social problems.
Yeah, well, thank you for your comments. Part of the BBQS program is to understand the environment. So I'm a psychiatrist, so I really appreciate your comment. And also a point that was on one of Ashley's slides that noted one potential area of risk is potentially leaving out some of the social factors that we might not be capturing with our AI models, and yet nevertheless may be important, because we know that there are social determinants of health, including social determinants of mental health, and they're operating always, whether we measure them or not. And so I really appreciate your point, and thank you for raising it. I wonder if our panelists have any comments they'd like to share or thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a healthy thing to think and say often. I mean, I think the worry that I was trying to articulate is something like, when you get a really good hammer, everything's a nail, right? And so how do you think about what is it that you're aiming at? And I know, your work on depression, are we aiming at what we might call a curative technology? That's probably a misfire. We should probably be aiming at assistive things. And maybe as we get farther down the line, I think we've seen this with like Parkinson's and the way that, deep brain stimulation has been kind of integrated into Parkinson's or epilepsy, is that we've realized we need neuropsychologists, we need psychiatrists, we need social work, we need lots of people to be kind of partnering to understand how this data, but also the technology and what that means for well-being. So I think that's like exactly the right type of comment to make. And I don't know if you, being the person who kind of does research in that space, how you feel about that.
Yeah, I agree. The social factors are critical. So we obviously have to start somewhere. So I think as we get better sensors for behavioral and neural monitoring. We can also think about monitoring social interactions or monitoring behavior and neural data in the context of social interactions so that we can take into account those environmental and social factors as well.
There's a really good comment, yesterday too, about how you use what you understand. Do you use it to then just better understand the phenomena so that you don't even need I think it was like you don't need a pill or you don't need a neurotechnology, but just to understand some of the underpinnings of mental health to then better inform social work, better inform school interventions, which might be a more hopeful way to think about some of this.
Please go ahead.
Hi, yes, I'm Jeffrey Herron, a University of Washington professor who works mostly on bidirectional systems in the space of adaptive neuromodulation. And one of the things, the challenges that I kind of struggle with in some ways is as we're focusing now increasingly on closed loop neuromodulation techniques, these devices are getting incredibly complicated. They're not just passive data collection platforms that produce a data set. They are interacting in real time with the nervous system and adjusting the behavior of the nervous system in real time. And these devices require very often a lot of extra processing and in many times decision makings by algorithms, either on board the device or in the distributed sense. And all this data in many ways necessarily is potentially falling through the cracks, but might be actually really critical in the longer term for understanding what the heck happened in this session. If you want to have data that's being, machine mineable or captured by future people in a shared context, what should we be doing in these closed loop neuromodulation studies for capturing the intermittent linear discriminant outputs? Do these all just go in some CSV file somewhere, or what can we do to be capturing this to make it kind of better practices to allow kind of the processing that we're talking about in all this work?
Yeah, so we do save all the data. Maybe not in the ideal file format, and I think that a major challenge is how do we actually have a standardized file format such that we can share across different closed loop neuromodulation experiments across different conditions. And I think some of your work will come in very relevant in terms of how we want to share and disseminate such data sets, including closed loop data sets.
I would say time goes only in one direction as far as I know right now. So any data that's collected kind of lives along that timeline, right? And could be streamed into some system. In the context of this program, I think we need to understand chronic recordings, long-term recordings. And so that neuromodulation setup itself unwraps itself over time, right? So as long as that data is being collected and stored, then the models kind of come in on how to interpret and do the data. So the first part, I think, is the easier part of collecting and storing that data. The second part, how to analyze it, is a whole different ballgame.
As Satra said, time only goes in one direction. I'm aware that we are out of time, but I do want our three remaining people lined up to have a chance to ask their questions, and I'm aware that some people might need to leave, but please go ahead, Grace.
I'll try to make this short, but thank you for a wonderful session. I think it was so nicely organized to hear the sequence, and listening to Mariam's description of what she does in her lab and Ashley's cautionary tales with ethics and Satra's infrastructure. But I'm thinking you want to create an ecosystem with the whole community. So everything you've all described will increase exponentially in complexity, from how you organize your lab, social, culturally, technologically, and ethically, and infrastructurally. It seems so idealistic. How do you imagine, all the other questioners that asked those questions, how do you imagine addressing that without perhaps some professional industry contractors helping you collect all the uncertainties in all the data, or to harmonize the standards with all the mavericks of brain initiative investigators, what they do, and how do you, use organizational psychology to make them all work together?
Don't look at me.
I think that the word yesterday was systems engineering, right? This is a team effort. It's not just us. And I think that's where we would bring in people who can answer some of those challenges. I showed the picture of the twins, and I always kind of think through the developmental lens. The kid has to take a step at one point in time. And so instead of kind of thinking about the walls that I might run into, let's take that first step and see what walls we run into and use the team science approach to reduce it.
Yeah. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, always a challenge to be brief when it's such a complex space to talk about. But when I hear all this effort being put into sharing tools, I'm excited about that. But I feel like as a computational neuroscientist and behavioral biologist, I'm Pamela Reinigal from UCSD, by the way. I feel like there's this expectation of chasing the bleeding edge of lots of technologies in each lab, which seems both very difficult and very inefficient. You know, that there's tools out there that use absolutely cutting edge machine learning. For example, it's moving daily. So do I also need to be a machine learning, specialist and also an electrical engineer and all these things? And so I always have this fantasy that the person who's delivering that technology wants to collaborate with me in the sense of like, come to my lab and set that system up, please. And that's too big of an ask for the people who are developing it. So I just wanted to invite some thought of thinking outside the box about how we structure science institutions and careers may be necessary. Do we need people who are collaborative consultants who simply their whole job is to travel between these labs and cross over those technologies? Or do we need institutions? Like OpenScope comes to mind as an experiment in that places that people can go to use technology, something a little more new than just every lab adopting these technologies internally. That's not really a question, but
I think that's a fantastic idea, and we need to have that. So again, at MIT, one of the things we have is there's some internal funding to create new collaborations. I think this space may have some of those same ideas of saying, so there are two stages, right? Creating connections is one. The second thing is career setting components that allow kind of exchange. So I would say if exchange can happen, right? Somebody who develops the technology spends a month in your lab.
Right, but I'm just finding, I don't think that's practical at the scale that is necessary. So I feel like we're needing bridge people or bridge institutions.
Yeah, that's a good thought to think about maybe for some of our dissemination and training efforts. Thank you. And thank you all for staying for our last question. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this really nice session. As I was getting really excited about the devices and the technology available, I started to think in terms of equity and representation within the data sets. And I started thinking about in my institution, I'm at a historically Black college, and when we collect data from our participants, primarily Black or African American, and EEG data is so difficult to collect from African American women. And it comes to the hair issue, and that's just one example. Or if I'm just doing, heart rate or something like that, and how challenging it is, especially if we're using the photoplethysmograph and it doesn't record accurately in darker skin, how might we be addressing that, or have the program thought about some of those things in terms of the context of collecting data and storing accurate data, because it really is slowly becoming a problem that's recognized in medical field. We just published a paper on some of those pain studies and using light and seeing a huge disparity, and that previous data might be misrepresented. So have you thought about how we might address some of that?
So I think there's two great points you're raising. One is on the sensor technologies, right? So we need better sensor technologies for heart rate monitoring, for skin conductance that address all of these disparities. As you say, better EEG devices, perhaps dry electrodes. So I think that's a great direction to be going in. And actually, I think there's a BBQS sensor program to be kicked off, and it can indeed address those challenges. The other one is representation within the population. So we do really try to match the demographics of our community and make sure that we have representation across every racial and ethnic groups within our current sensor technologies and recordings, and look at it like a representative sample. So I think in both directions we can make progress.
Thank you.
Great. I'd like to thank our speakers, and I thank all of you for staying for the Q&A, and we're adjourned.